Well, thanks for coming, everyone. A fair number of people I know here have never been to an EA event before, so I might just quickly describe what we're all about. EA is about doing good smartly, maybe. That's kind of how I'd put it. Effectively, thank you. Effective altruism, not just wishy-washy platitudes and the sort, but actually working out how to optimally do good, whatever good means, and that's half the discussion, is what does good mean. Anyway, so my presentation today is about universal basic income. I haven't had as much time as I would have liked to prepare it, so the format and stuff will reflect that, but it's a fun topic, and I think everyone's going to probably enjoy some of the arguments and things we see here. Cool, so about me, I did a Bachelor of Science here, majoring in geography. Just finished an honours project on the psychology of climate change denialism, probably pursuing a PhD in psychology at some point, and my research interest is conflict. I love it. It's the best thing ever. It's so good. So in this presentation, what I want to do is define everything, obviously, and scope and all that sort of thing. Contextualise the ideas, bit of history to a lot of this stuff, of course, being politics. What I'm going to do, which is a bit different to maybe some talks, is the focus of this, and most of the slides in here are just looking at all of the objections that people give to the idea. And then I'm going to discuss the implications for effective altruism. So, universal basic income is basically the idea that the current welfare system in most countries in the world should be overhauled and replaced. It's a policy proposal with a universal basic income. So universal means there's no conditions to it. It's not, for example, means tested, income tested, anything like that. It's a right, not a privilege. A universal human right, or maybe an unconditional human right. We'll get to some of the complexities around that. It's basic, so it's enough to survive, not to thrive, and it's not enough to survive. So you can live on this. It's not going to be anything fancy, but you can live on it. And it's cash payments. That's really important because it gives people the opportunity to do whatever they want with the money, as opposed to, for example, food stamps or that sort of thing. Lots of other names for it: unconditional basic income, citizens' basic income guarantee, basic living stipend, guaranteed annual income, universal income security program, universal demigrant. Andrew Yang, who ran for president in the United States just recently, called it a freedom dividend because his focus group said, hey, the Americans will love that. That was, he tried all these different combinations of terms, and that was the one that polled best with the focus group. Notice the differences in framing for different cultural contexts, whether it's framed as a stipend, a dividend, whatever. In some more individualistic cultures, that works better. In some more collectivist cultures, it's better to frame it around rights. So there are some existing policies around the world similar to UBI, and historical policies as well. Just a few that I'm putting here. Universal social pension systems. Australia doesn't have one of these, but New Zealand does. They're like UBI, but they have one condition, which is that you're old. Australia's is means tested on income and assets, excluding the family home. There's Bolsa Familia, which is in Brazil. There's a couple of really, really simple conditions. So child vaccination and school attendance. There's a lot of people who are benefited by this. This also doesn't meet the definition of basic income because it's not enough to live on. There is also the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which is a dividend on the oil that Alaska state-owned oil drilling makes, basically, the money that they make. That varies year to year. It generally is between $1,000 and $2,000 per month, and it actually has massively influenced the politics of Alaska. Very interesting. So this, comparison to means-tested welfare systems. So income means testing often produces financial disincentives to work. This is kind of the first axiom of UBI. So that can produce something called welfare dependency. So that's where people have like a disincentive to work at a certain level of income, and so they don't try and work to make more money than that because they're better off just staying below it and not having to work. In places like Australia, the way that the government tries to get around this is to make you apply for 40 jobs in a month or whatever. Means testing bureaucracies are also massive, inefficient dehumanisation machines. There's a great film on this. I haven't actually watched it. I really want to. Daniel Blake. Yeah, it's pretty well reviewed, and it seems like a really interesting thing to watch. It's this guy who's really well-meaning and stuff. He tries to go through the system, and it just chews him up and spits him out. Related policies. So there's conditional basic income as well. So that's a more conditional form of the policy, but it normally refers to things that are less conditional than, say, the Australian system. Requires means testing for any conditions imposed, obviously. And then a really interesting one is the negative income tax. This is very, very similar to universal basic income in the way that it actually performs. In terms of the final amount of money that a person sees in their bank account, it's the same. Where you see the difference is where the money is picked up. So this is all done through taxation. So you get your UBI as a tax return. So it's like everyone pays tax, and then poorer people get a really big tax return back. So there's a few differences between the three, and it requires income testing because it's a taxation thing, but it's really almost non-conditional. There's not much in it. There is a psychological difference. Wealthier people never directly see their social dividend paid out. So, they never see that little green $1,000 in their balance sheet or whatever. Martin Luther King, he wanted a universal basic income. And then on the other side of the political spectrum, we had Milton Friedman, who advocated for a negative income tax. Very interesting, that kind of bipartisan thing. We'll see a bit more of that here. Nixon actually tried to implement a universal basic income. Well, it was actually a negative income tax in 1969, but he was actually blocked by Democrats, conservative Democrats in the Senate, quite ironically. He wanted to be like the champion of the people and all this, which was quite funny, looking at Republicans these days. But yeah, the Democrats blocked him. They were like, we want it to be higher. And then it ended up getting stalled, and then stagflation happened, and the idea was lost. That, by the way, is all documented in this book here, if you're interested. Many trials around the world have been performed on UBI and NITs, often with very, very positive results. The largest negative income tax was income in Manitoba, Canada. That was basically a whole town in Canada that had, for 3 years, a negative income tax implemented. They put all the results away, and then a Conservative government got elected into power, and they never got to actually analyse the results, but those have since been analysed. There have been lots of other places, Finland, India, South Africa, lots of other places that have done it as well. None of them have been particularly rigorous, though, because of changes in governments and things. So relevance for effective altruism. Poverty reduction cause area, obviously. By design, this is an anti-poverty measure. It's not the only reason that it's been advocated. Like, I don't think Milton Friedman advocated it for an anti-poverty measure, but it is... it was part of Nixon's reasoning, but some of his aides kind of talked him out of it. Mental health cause area. Wage slavery is a common issue in Western society, but this forces employers to become ethical because employees can just walk, which is kind of cool. It's politically popular, and it's not as partisan as other issues. So since the pandemic in Australia, I think I saw some research from Tim Hollow did it, I think, actually. Before the pandemic, it was something like 47% of people in Australia were in favour of UBI. Post-pandemic, I think this was like half a year ago, it was like 58%, so it jumped a lot. Because people can see, with the direct payments that are going on, it's not really causing that many problems. So yeah, relatively easy to build coalitions, which I think is kind of interesting. So it seems like such an obvious policy to implement, right? And we don't have it. So the question for tonight's talk is, are there legitimate reasons why we don't have it? Or is it actually something worth advocating? Now, me personally, I would definitely vote for this if a referendum were held today. I know a lot of people who wouldn't, but personally I would. And this is a bias. Absolutely. So there's something called directionally motivated reasoning, and there's investments and sunk costs here, which can incentivize someone like me to conveniently forget certain things when I'm reasoning about something like this, right? So maybe I want to be seen as a competent researcher or whatever. So confirmation bias can kick in here. Other people are also likely to have investments that cloud their reasoning, and this is why we don't have consensus, even though it is a relatively popular issue. It's funny, what you see is kind of factions within different parts of the political spectrum that agree and disagree, even though they're in the same camp in other ways. So today we're going to try and do something called actively open-minded thinking, which is something that professional debaters try to cultivate. We're going to try and put ourselves in the perspective of someone who doesn't like this. It's the tendency to evaluate arguments and evidence without undue bias from one's own private beliefs. This metric was defined to measure how well a person deals with confirmation bias. UBI is not implemented, so there must be some reasons for that people hold, and that's what we're going to explore today. So we're going to steelman the position. That's the opposite of doing the straw man fallacy. So we're going to construct an argument that's hard to tear down. This is a really widely discussed issue. So there's essentially an algorithm we can follow here, which is go online, look for hilarious comments and things, put them all together and work out what the commonalities are. So what I've done is basically that. Let's go with a list of objections. So a lot of these are going to look daft, so I haven't actually copied them verbatim. What I've done instead is kind of been charitable with them and taken the bits that are actually saying something and taken out all the insults and that sort of thing. Because there are underlying premises. Like, people don't say this stuff. Like, people get angry and then they express their anger, but people also have kind of substance to their anger as well sometimes. So let's start with the bipartisan and non-partisan objections. UBI is unaffordable. This is probably the second most common objection that you hear, or the most common, depending how it's looked at. So here's a couple of quotes. It would bankrupt the government. Or the second one is from a friend of mine I was chatting with last night. He said, you'd have to go down the route of either higher taxes to a point where you end up shrinking an economy which benefits no one, well, often the rich, or MMT mechanisms, which is purely theoretical at the moment, and the assumptions like reserve bank control over your country currency and an isolated economy aren't realistic. And MMT, for anyone who doesn't know, is modern monetary theory, which is a theory about how governments can, instead of trying to target interest rates, start targeting full employment and not care about debt as much. So there's a response to that, which is, analysis does suggest that savings can far exceed costs depending on the implementation. So UBI is likely to grow the economy in these implementations and allow for reduced taxation at the same time, which sounds very counterintuitive. So there's a couple of... there's a paper here which I kind of want to show, which kind of shows where some of these savings are coming from and why this is actually likely to happen. And it is quite counterintuitive. So I'll see if I can crack that open. Oh, of course, I've got no internet. Hold on. Oh, look, I'll just sort of summarise them. I'll spot you up. I'll just summarise them. It's things like increased taxation because of increased velocity of money in the economy. You don't have to spend on all of the bureaucracy. There's savings in healthcare costs. There's savings in pension systems, superannuation systems. Like, the list goes on. There's enormous amounts of research that's been done on this. There's a great website here. Maybe I can put it up later. By the Canadian Centre of Economic Advancement, I think they call themselves. But they looked at, there was an Ontario basic income pilot, and if they used the same setup that they used in that, they would be finding that it would be growing the economy around 2.8% according to their modelling over 25 years, which is pretty big. Exactly. So it's the equivalent, they say, of adding a new hospitality and tourism industry to Canada, implementing this policy, because of the massive amount of economic stimulus that this provides by putting money directly in the hands of people who are going to spend it the most. It's pretty incredible and very counterintuitive. It is, when thinking about this, it is worth considering the pension system, because the pension system is a UBI, not in Australia, but in New Zealand and in other countries like Denmark. the pension system has, before the introduction of the pension system, people were saying the same thing, it's unaffordable. But we look at it now and we'd kind of laugh at that. So it is worth taking that into consideration. So I haven't fully dealt with that. If you want to read those reports, I can, that paper and that report, I can put them somewhere later. So objection 2, UBI causes inflation. There's a few ways that people postulate that this would happen. The first is through printing money or quantitative easing. And the second one is through basically demand increasing and then everyone wants a certain product. So an example is everyone wants real estate now because they can afford it and there aren't enough houses to go around, so wouldn't that cause inflation? So that's a quote, someone saying that. But most UBI proposals have nothing to do with QE or printing money. They're financed via taxation. There's no money created or destroyed, so there's no inflation that can happen. Now, demand for certain goods and services may increase. This is actually very likely in housing and in things like groceries. And there's reports on this as well. In that Cancia report, they go into it in detail because people can afford them now. But then that rise in demand creates more jobs in servicing that demand. Supply increases to meet demand. And so often you need a transition period for this. It doesn't create inflation though. It just creates shortages in the near term for certain goods and services. Objection 3, UBI is inefficient. Most recipients don't need it. To give someone money who doesn't need it is a waste of government money. It would be significantly cheaper to provide money just to those who need it. This is kind of a moral claim, but it kind of ignores the cost of means testing, the psychological benefits and the reduced stigma of UBI, the economic stimulus effects of UBI, the cost of social harms like mental health issues caused by financial insecurity, issues with welfare dependency, failures of service uptake. The list goes on. And of course, UBI provides all of that. So of course, it's very easy to argue that all people need that. So I'm not very convinced by that one, but it's there as an objection. Objection 4, welfare should be temporary. So programs like welfare and unemployment should be temporary programs to offer assistance, not a fixed solution to providing income to individuals. Now, it's hard to be charitable with something like this because they haven't really given a good reason why. But if we kind of think, okay, what's the good reason why? I'm sure they've got one. I'm sure, maybe. But yeah, UBI is temporary assistance. You can think of it that way because it's premised on income. Once you start earning more, you don't get as much money as you're paying through taxation. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't really follow that objection. Objection 4, UBI will be too politically popular or irreversible. This is really interesting because this is true. This is very, very true, right? Anybody who tries to reduce it will be booted out of office. Much harder to reverse once it's implemented. There are a number of associated issues with this as well. So this actually happened in Alaska. So I think it was the reigning Democratic governor was like, we're not making enough oil. We're going to have to reduce these payments. And then they kicked him out and voted in the Republican who did all this horrible stuff in other areas. So, because it becomes this issue that makes or breaks a politician. Now, that's a real issue with an oil currency, like an oil economy. But a national UBI would be premised on tax revenue, which is far less volatile. It's more diversified, however you want to think of it. You can think of the citizens as shareholders, and this is why Andrew Yang framed as a dividend, right? It's a dividend on economic growth, right? So I don't really agree with that either, even though it's very interesting to think about, and it's true that it does cause, like it will be extremely politically popular. It already is in Australia, even though we don't have it. So we get to the economic left objections. That's all the non-partisan ones done. So UBI, this is really common for some reason, this one. UBI wouldn't change the fundamental nature of class relations or the growth mindset. Elites will use UBI to save themselves from an uprising. I think American communists love this objection in particular. I mean, you can read that. It's all just the same stuff, right? The rich need to die, and they're not going to die if we have UBI, right? They're going to use it to save themselves, Yeah, righto. I mean, that...
Why people particularly care about class relations absent poverty?
Exactly, right? I'm trying not to question, I'm trying to be really generous, but yeah, it's not meant to do that. It's kind of irrelevant to the economic merits of the idea. It's like a total non sequitur. These are not problems that UBI seeks to solve. And I'm pretty convinced that these people would probably go away if UBI was implemented as well. Yeah, it's a side effect if any of that happens. It's the same with economic inequality, actually. UBI is not necessarily a solution to economic inequality. It's not proposed that way. If it happens, which it does, to reduce economic inequality, that's more of a side effect than the reason for its implementation. The second objection, UBI provides to rich people who do not need the extra money. I mean, this one seems so obvious, but alas, a lot of people seem to actually rely on this. The problem with this is that rich people will pay more tax than they receive back in the form of UBI. So no, they're not getting money. It looks like they're getting money, and that's why it becomes politically popular. It's like Medicare. Like, everyone here is paying for Medicare through taxation, but we all get to benefit from it, so we all think that we're not. Kind of. It's interesting psychology of it. But that's kind of the really great thing about UBI. And this is why it's so politically popular as well, is everyone sees that benefit directly, even though the tax rates change. Cool. Objection 3, UBI is geographically unjust. The cost of living is vastly different in different places. True, to a large extent. Another interesting one to think about, right? So what's the cost of living in Canberra? Like, high? What's the cost of living in Albury, DJ? Yeah, like a third, right? So if I'm getting paid $1,000 a month and everything else is equal, I'm probably just going to move to Albury, right? And there'd be a lot of people who'd probably do stuff like that. Now, that's a legitimate possibility, right? But like, it's compensated for a large degree by the financial freedom that UBI will bring individuals. It's not necessarily disruptive either. It's not like they're exiting the economy or something. And migration out of cities may occur to some extent, but jobs and other opportunities will remain as pull factors in cities. We've seen this with Melbourne, and to a lesser extent some of the other bigger cities in coronavirus. Is Melbourne's housing prices have plummeted because everyone's just gotten out of there because they don't want to be locked down and whatnot. And like, these things can happen with policy changes or with, in this case, a crisis, but it's not bad, it's just change. But a lot of people will interpret it as bad. Objection 4, UBI will further marginalise poor people. So Andrew Yang's plan included a 10% value-added tax, VAT, to finance the part of the proposal that wasn't directly financed by reduced healthcare costs and by increased taxation and a few other things. The objection goes, poor people transact more often, so they're going to be disproportionately impacted. Well, relative to their income, they transact more often. This was actually an issue in... there's a bit more here too. So there's also the idea that, if you're going to implement a UBI, you're going to be getting rid of minimum wage, you're going to be getting rid of, social health, you're going to be getting rid of all this other stuff, is kind of the premise here as well. With VATs, that is a fair critique. It was an issue in Australia with the introduction of the GST. It's why John Howard had to sit down with a couple of Western Australian Greens senators to kind of work out what was and wasn't covered by GST. So that's worth considering. But again, value-added taxes are a kind of marginal way that is normally chosen to finance UBI. It's not mainstream. I think Yang's is the only that I know of that relies on a VAT or similar. And yeah, with the rest of it, it's a fair critique of certain proposals again, but there's a good quote from Guy Standing. There's nothing in the concept of UBI to suggest that it should replace other benefits, so there's no reason to claim that it would increase poverty. Guy Standing is one of the premier academics on UBI at London School of Economics, and he's right about that. You don't have to design it so it increases poverty. That's a decision that a government makes. In Canada, there was talk of introducing a UBI just before I think Harper got into power, about 2004. And the particular policy proposal was actually going to disproportionately hurt poor people. But there was like massive uproar about that and it never got through. So, that's a policy decision. Objection 5, UBI will be used as a tool of class warfare. Right-wingers and rich people support the idea, and this includes Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, people like Milton Friedman, you know, the holy economist of the libertarians. So there must be ulterior motives, goes the logic. They're seeking to buy you off as a voter so that they can destroy the welfare state. It's a Trojan horse for the libertarians, all this sort of thing.
Are these objections on YouTube?
They're from all over the place. I've been, for about 2 or 3 months, just kind of, whenever I see one, I grab it. So some UBI proposals include abolishing the minimum wage, dismantling all social safety nets and so on. But again, most mainstream proposals represent a sizable transfer of wealth from the current, saved from current externalities and inefficiencies and transferred to ordinary people, as well as sometimes increased taxation on rich people. Now, due to increased bargaining power of citizens, minimum wage laws, pensions and superannuation could well become less necessary in UBI. That is actually worth consideration, because if you think about it, the purpose of minimum wage is to give employees bargaining power. Now, if you're able to just walk from a job anyway, the employer is then forced to make that job good enough that you'd want to do it of your own accord anyway, right? So, you know, it is worth considering whether minimum wage laws could be abolished. I personally am not in favour of it, but in the long run, who knows, maybe society would go in that direction. There could be good reasons to do it. So, yeah, it's not a dumb argument, it's just something that is worth consideration. UBI is a privileged first world idea. This is another sort of theme that we see. This is actually interesting. So if you're not okay with the concept of lowest class citizens of a first world country being taxed to fund a UBI for the third world, then you have no place arguing for UBI as a human right. Now, I actually agree with that argument. I think there's something to that, right? UBI concepts are reliant on a globalized supply chain that's 100% dependent on marginalized labor, makes the first world prosper at the expense of the disparity of wealth in the downstream of retail. So, I mean, this is a critique of all supposed universal human rights, which is basically that they have to be administered by states, and states have jurisdictions. The UN doesn't really have the hard power to enforce any of this stuff, or the soft power at this point. So, I mean, this is more a criticism of the universality of human rights. Like, for example, if you look at Canada's charter, right? They've got a Declaration of Rights. It's got like access to housing, access to food security, all this sort of stuff in it. That's Canada, you know. Same with America's Bill of Rights and whatnot. Like, yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. But if we just think about, and that's ultimately why it relates to the notion of open borders and labour liberalisation. I mean, we've had trade liberalisation over the last like 30, 40 years. This is the idea of labour liberalisation, another thing that's explored in depth in that book. Highly recommended. So it's also important to note that some of the countries most likely to implement UBI in the near future include places like South Africa, India, Namibia, places like this that have the most experience with it, and it could become a right within that country. So again, I don't think it's a killer of an argument. It's not going to destroy the idea. Objection 7, federal job guarantee or raising minimum wage is better policy. This is Bernie Sanders in a nutshell. Right? This is why he never supported it, even though Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard, both the other kind of lefty candidates in the American election, supported it. Richard Wolff is a prominent economist, and if you kind of want to know where this reasoning comes from, go and look up his videos. It's related to old-style Keynesian economics, but it's also like got a bit of MMT in there and stuff like that. So it goes along with views like everyone should have the opportunity to make money, but it shouldn't just be handed out to them. Now, that sounds kind of right-wing, but it's actually not. It's within this idea that there is dignity in labour itself, and what people are missing is the ability to give their labour rather than just having, a cash transfer. Now, the federal job guarantee is an interesting economic perspective that arises from MMT, seeing the state's role as one of maintaining full employment, like I said earlier, even if you run a budget deficit if necessary, because otherwise it's just kind of wasted labour. Both of these policy proposals do increase workers' bargaining power and reduce economic inequality. I think that's great. But I'm not personally on Bernie Sanders' side in this issue, and the reason is that they kind of have their own status quo definition of work, which doesn't consider job losses due to automation, for example, or issues with exploitation of volunteer labour, and things like caretaker roles, arts, things like this, or facilitating risk-taking in places like arts, business, and so forth. People need a safety net, in my view, to stand on in order to kind of take risks, and that's where innovation comes from. So if we... This kind of conception of how we reduce economic inequality doesn't consider that, in my view. Bernie Sanders and Richard Wolff would disagree. I'm sure we could have a big conversation if they were here. Yes, it also doesn't address welfare dependency and stigma. So, Objection 8. UBI allows for corporate freeloading and exploitation of workers. Now, this is a really interesting one. This came from a professional economist. So, UBI allows employers to push wages below subsistence and then rely on the government to subsidise the difference. The net effect is to lower the base level of wages, which reduces tax revenue and privatises the profits. It also disincentivises innovation because labour is then so cheap. And another way of saying the same thing, UBI is just a technique for driving wages down. Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, two very neoliberal right-wing economists, pushed it for these reasons. If the policy comes with a reduced minimum wage, corporations can reduce what they pay in labour and pocket the savings. Now, this all looks obvious, but it makes the assumption that UBI will replace minimum wage again. This is false in most cases. So it also does ignore that a livable UBI presents workers with the power again to walk if they need to. And providing a low-risk environment to start their own business that directly competes with, for example, their employer who isn't treating them very well. Reduced tax revenue is also a perilous assumption because there seems to actually be consensus in the literature on UBI that tax revenue will be increased substantially by the policy, not reduced. And the reason for that is more transactions overall due to the higher velocity of money. That is, poor people spend money more. So if you give poor people money, then the velocity of money, the total amount of transactions happening in the economy, rises. That can be taxed, and often is. It is in Australia. Way more people above the tax-free threshold as well if you give people money. And then there's also taxable economic growth and things like that. You're not convinced?
Can you go over that response a bit more? Because
Yep.
I'm not seeing how you can prevent employers from decreasing wages, even if it's not the intention.
So are we removing the minimum wage, in what you're asking here? Or are we keeping the minimum wage and then just adding a UBI?
Okay, so you're saying, if the society decided to keep their minimum wage,
Yep.
That would be a kind of safety net for people.
Yep.
Employers wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, this couldn't happen if the minimum wage was kept, right? This objection here. UBI allowing employers to push wages below subsistence level. That can't happen if, by law, they're above subsistence level, right? But if we do get rid of the minimum wage, as some UBI proposals do, then this objection is something to consider.
Does it make sense though if the UBI is at least subsistence level? Unless wages are somehow negative, in which case...
UBI by definition is at least subsistence level. So that's what the basic is. Sorry, go on.
So the objection just seems incoherent then. We might say the wage someone is paid is below subsistence level, but by definition they're also getting a UBI, so they must be above.
Exactly. This is more of a class warfare perspective. This guy is very much in Richard Wolff and Bernie Sanders' lane when it comes to how he thinks about economics. And
Yeah.
This is just the American communists again, basically. It's the same thing.
The third point is also very good for that matter. Because you've got this subsistence level, you're not as tied down to the job, right? So that you could more easily walk and go somewhere else, whereas that's not as common in today's society because
Yeah, it gives people more bargaining power.
If you didn't have the minimum wage, employers would be less inclined to lower it.
Yeah, right. If you're getting a subsistence level and someone says, "I'll pay you $5 an hour to do this hard job," you're like, "F you! I'd rather find someone else to start my own business."
I'd rather go do my own hard job that actually produces me benefit.
More because they want to be more attractive.
But there's always people in the
So Jenna, maybe if we go through the rest of the objections, because a lot of this is actually dealt with, and then we can come back to the question and answers, because trust me, people have put this stuff in the comments, and I've got to it. So we'll just get to it. Sorry. Cool. So, but do ask questions. Don't feel like you can't ask questions. So we're getting to now to the economic right? So people who are very much in kind of this lane, right? Now there's some interesting stuff here. The most common objection of all is actually in this category. So yeah, socialist garbage, capitalism is good, and I'm worried UBI might interfere with it. Those are direct quotes. Yeah, I know. It's honest, right? It's great. Cool. So yeah, there's a bit of a vague objection since there's many reasons a person might make this claim. Normally it's de facto objection to downward wealth transfers premised on the sort of dole bludger welfare queen logic that we saw from Thatcher and Reagan onwards. UBI actually does stimulate meritocracy better than our existing system in some ways. So because it removes those structural impediments and allows that risk-taking and that innovation. UBI experiments have seen as much as over 300% increase in new business startups in Namibia. And it's the same in any trial that you look at. People start businesses, lots of them. That's kind of one of the first sort of things that we see in all the evidence that has ever come out of UBI trials. So yeah, I mean, that's just something that I think the person making this argument has no idea of, but they don't really want to know it either, I don't think. Now, this is the most common objection, and that's why there's so many quotes here. UBI disincentivizes work and or causes laziness, right? So I just want to read some of these because they're great. If everybody could receive an income as a basic right, then there would be little motivation to do better and work harder in society. You have to earn your money that you make. No one should just give you your money. If you want to make money, you've got to work. Just looking for a free ride. People should work hard for their money and earn the things that they deserve. You sit on the sofa and get paid to do nothing. It eliminates personal responsibility. And if people are given free money, they'll become lazy. This may then have a viral effect. And more people will stop working when they see others getting money without any work. And finally, I think it makes sense, but it's impossible to implement. Too many Americans are lazy and would simply take the money and lay around and smoke weed or do worse drugs and drink themselves to death. Oh, and then they'll blame society for enabling them. This last quote actually came from an academic that I know. Probably not social policy. That's it. I think Zach's onto it. So what do you say to this, right? What do you say to this? Well, to be charitable, right? Yeah, it can be read as follows, right? I don't believe in universal human rights. An individual's right to exist should be premised on their desire and their ability to provide labour. That's essentially what all of that's saying, right? Now, financial security, which is, it's basically the threat of death or social exclusion, is the only or main force that incentivizes work. Now, this comes directly actually out of social Darwinism. Same ideology that Nazism came out of. There is actually historical links here. So there's a German economist who, he was, I think, part of the Third Reich, but he was actually the major influence on Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. I can't remember the dude's name. If you want the info, I can get it to you. Very interesting, because this is the dominant view of labour in our society today. And it is also psychologically, it's a type of defensive projection. So this is where you come up with a rationalisation in order to sort of justify your own behaviours. And you then ascribe that motive to someone else. So what these people are saying is, I would do nothing if I was paid unconditionally, and I worry that this desire itself would undermine the policy. Fair, but that's projection. It's not actually an indication of other people's beliefs and intentions. This entire book was written about just this objection. You can see how thick that is. And the premise of this book can be summed up as, people are trustworthy.
The Dutch title is Most People Are Pretty Good or something.
Most people are actually pretty good. It's kind of the summary of this book. But evidence is for noobs. So anyway, but yeah, it's a very interesting, this is something that if you are advocating for UBI or if you're even interested in, you'll see this everywhere. And knowing what to say is kind of a bit, well, okay, I don't agree, but you're entitled to your opinions. But yeah, study it. It's really interesting. Now, this is a great cartoon, actually. I'll just read it out. Maybe I can zoom in. Can you all read that, or? My eyes are bad, so I'm projecting. So, do you want me to turn the lights off? Would that help? Lights off. Dim 1, dim 2, dim 1. Oh man, that's cool.
Yeah, it looks pretty readable. I mean, I don't know.
I'm going to just summarize it for anyone who has bad eyes like me, right? So in 1842, it's like, if workers can legally strike, no businesses will be able to survive. And it just goes on, right? This is how, not giving black people the right to vote and, women the right to work and so on was all justified. And now we get to 2020. Or 2021, if unconditional basic income passes, no one will work. And it's interesting to see the historical parallels. Like, it's not an argument, but it does give some context to the sorts of things that people say before policies become policy that look ridiculous after policies become policy. Cool. All right, so that response continued. So this is not necessarily just a right-wing objection. It's really anybody who's been socialized into seeing the world through a lens of competition being the way to do things. Read up about neoliberalism, I guess, and the history of it particularly. All data ever collected on the topic strongly disproves this notion, like ridiculously strongly. The only reductions in work hours you ever see in any of the data that's ever been collected has been people like single mothers who go on to care for people, or expectant mothers, like people who spend more time on their education, people who exercise more, like people who do useful stuff. They don't spend it on alcohol, So anyway, definition of work, that's something to consider as well. Things like childcare are work, but in our society we don't call them work, we don't pay them accordingly. Now escapism and withdrawal also are symptoms of stress. UBI helps to reduce stress, the mental health benefits of it. So it can actually only increase people's desire to get out and about in the long run. Just from, again, sort of a psychological perspective on that. And intrinsic motivation to work has been known about forever. This is part of how the Soviet Union was still successful as an economy, was people were like, actually, it's kind of nice to do things for people, So yeah, read up about intrinsic motivation to work if you're interested. And again, business startups. Objection 3, UBI is unfair or violates freedom. You don't deserve it. So the classic meme that you see from the right wingers here is taxation is theft, right? You also see things like, food and other basic necessities require other people to work and produce them. So why should someone who does not work freely reap the benefits of their labour? It's a slap in the face to people who work for their living. You got to make it on your own. And just because you're poor doesn't mean you deserve it, deserve some money or whatever. And this one's kind of long, but basically, capitalism is all about voluntary association, and this is not very voluntary. Compelling people to give their money to the state to redistribute to the poor. That kind of thing. So it's a reframing of Objection 2. It's just, that's all it is. It's not really... the difference with this objection is that it's more about the difference between collectivism and individualism. So it's not really unfair because that's kind of a selective framing of the situation. Although we are expected to pay other people's UBIs, we're at the same time granted access to our own, and so that society may pick us up at a time of our need, right? That's why it's called social security. The idea that we people are better off when we rely on others, like that is collectivism in a nutshell. That's quite a confronting notion to a lot of people in the West, particularly in the States. Europe is not so bad with this. They kind of understand it a bit more. But I think a lot of people don't really want to recognize how dependent they are on others. It's kind of an affront to their self-esteem or something like that. Anyway, we all have to deal with, I mean, this is the obvious one. Like, we all have to deal with the cost of poverty. You know, you walk down to Garama Place and there's some guy being like, oh, mate, you're going to lie, you know, all this sort of thing. He wouldn't be there in a UBI world, right? So there are direct benefits that are coming to us. And it is in our interests, even if we don't consent, you know. We didn't consent to be born either. I don't know, is that unfair? Am I being uncharitable with that?
You just really hate seeing homeless people in Grima Place.
No, I don't hate seeing homeless people in Grima Place, but I don't like the fact that they're put in that situation, you know? And I don't think it has to be that way.
So when you say we all have to deal with the cost of poverty?
Yeah, so things like increased crime rates, which go with increased inequality, that's a linear relationship across societies, you know? So what you see, for example, South Africa is really bad for this, is, you know, walled communities with surveillance everywhere, armed guards and things like this, massive economic inequality, and everyone in the society suffers as a result. It's not some kind of isolated issue. Yeah, but they have to build them, and then they have to deal with the fact that they might get hijacked at a light or something like that. Your freedom is restricted, ultimately.
I mean, what if you want to, go for a walk in the park? But you're like,
Even if you are someone who supposedly benefits from this system, you're not really benefiting in these sorts of ways.
Benefit from the innovation that the poor people could potentially bring.
That's the other thing. Yeah, exactly. Economic inequality is a drain on economic growth is kind of the point there. Exactly. Objection 4, UBI is money for nothing and chicks for free. This is straight out of Dire Straits. I've seen it. I've seen this used as an objection to UBI, and I just thought it was funny to put in here. But again, it's projection. I would use the money to purchase the service of prostitutes, which of course I don't deserve, having not earned the money. This is clearly perverse, but the response to this is really obvious. Thanks to their increased bargaining power, those prostitutes might be a bit more expensive and discerning than this person expects after the introduction of UBI. And this is a practical example of how UBI will change the economy, right? Workers get to walk. Objection 5, UBI will cause economic immigration. Potentially causes massive economic immigration associated problem like increased tax burden. Again, this is like a wolf whistle for racists, or what? No, a wolf whistle. What do they call it? Dog whistle. That's different. But it's also an interesting consideration. It's kind of the parallel from the right of the geographical justice critique, right? And this again is a discussion about open borders. It's got nothing to do with UBI. It's kind of off topic. But it is worth mentioning, each individual who arrives in a country creates jobs by contributing to demand for services, and they pay their own tax. They're not all just, people who can't contribute or something. Now we get to the status quoism objections. Again, these are non-partisan, but they're all premised around this kind of, I don't want to think about it. So there is no need to seek to change the status quo. We already have safety nets. The current welfare system works fine. UBI advocates use inaccurate statistics to discredit a current welfare system that is doing wonders, and it's simply unnecessary. It is a basic fundamental human right to not starve or not be homeless, but we have programs for this, right? So this objection could only be made from a place of extreme privilege, I think it's fair to say. The current welfare system doesn't work fine. We've already talked about partly why that is. But it it's easy to sort of stand here in an academic seminar room and talk about that. But for people who are living it, this is really big stuff. People who don't have the freedom to take risks that they want to take to improve society. People who are trapped in that kind of the welfare dependency. People who are too stigmatized to seek help. People who have mental health issues because of the dehumanization of this thing. All the inefficiencies, people who hate their jobs working at Centrelink, that sort of thing. Existing programs are inefficient, dehumanising and paternalistic, and this does reduce their effectiveness. Wanting to improve on the current system is not the same thing as discrediting its successes so far. And that's the thing. They have been successful so far, but that's not necessarily a justification for always having them the same. There is something called the just world hypothesis, which is it's a common cognitive bias, which is the notion that the world is just and right. And the corollary of that is I don't have to do anything. So, it's important not to fall for that. And I think effective altruists in general would kind of agree with that. The second objection, UBI is less rewarding, or it's bad for mental health. They would appreciate it more if they earned the money. You'll lose purpose in life. Jobs give this. These are both things that I've seen. Again, I think this is really paternalistic. I know what other people need better than they do, whereas UBI is, well, give them the power to make the decision for themselves. It's unwarranted, it's prejudiced, and it's projection. Objection 3, UBI is not going to happen. It just ain't going to happen. And then what you see is the kind of but language. But, that's right. Sounds good on paper, that's right. You're a utopian. I remember when I was that idealistic. I think it makes sense, but all that sort of thing, right? More defense mechanisms here. The thought of change makes me uncomfortable. It's not a wonderful idea. I don't want to think about it. That's what they're saying, right? That's denial. That's reaction formation. There are other Freudian defense mechanisms that can be chucked in there as well. The ideas are causing stress in the form of cognitive dissonance, and they need to find some way to defend themselves from that stress, right? That's essentially what's happening. Now, the point that, again, Rutger Bregman makes is that the status quo is really the utopian position, because it's clearly not working as well as it needs to be. What is unrealistic? What is realistic? It's kind of important to think about things like the Overton window and what is considered acceptable discourse and what is not. So, implications for EA. That's the end of all the objections. I believe UBI is a cause worth exploring and probably a cause worth championing. But it does cut to the very core of our assumptions about others, ourselves, and our place in society. Rutger Bregman's books, read them if you are interested in these ideas. He's a Dutch historian who's kind of dedicated, 10 years to just putting it down on paper, exploring the idea, talking with people, all that sort of thing. He's the guy who influenced Andrew Yang. He's also the guy who influenced me and many other people I know. He's a very good communicator. Another takeaway from this talk, I hope, is that actively open-minded thinking can help us to understand an idea from an outsider's perspective, even if it's a lot of mental work. And I would add also, even if we don't agree with the objections, even if we think, there's a hole in that or whatever. Take every opportunity to engage with people who are a bit hesitant about UBI. Confront them with the evidence if you need to, and help them to get out of their own echo chambers, because ultimately a lot of us are in echo chambers, including me. I don't know a single person who isn't personally invested in these issues and who doesn't want more time for things like leisure, working out what they really want to do in life, all that kind of thing, right? And if you want to, donate to Give Directly. Give Directly is basically a not-for-profit UBI funding organisation. They basically, instead of doing what a lot of charities do and having all these middlemen and stuff, they just give the money directly to people who need it. They're doing programs now in the United States, which is kind of funny to me as well. So Give Directly have also done a lot of hard evidence, which is really worth looking at if you want to know about the effectiveness of various things. They're pretty good with that sort of stuff. Cool. So thanks for listening. That's the end of my talk. I might just turn my camera off and then I'll take questions.